All right, my watch tells me it's 5 past 5, which means we
Yes.
are ready to start. So, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everybody to our lecture series on digital humanism. Today, I'm very glad that we have a panel on a very hot topic, I would say, regulating the digital space, challenges in a changing world order. And I'm particularly happy that Christiane Wenderhorst agreed to moderate this because I was really looking for having an expert on this delicate topic also for the moderation. So let me just briefly introduce Christiane, and Christiane will then introduce the panel to you. Christiane is since 2008 professor at University of Vienna, where she is professor of civil law. And I just would like to mention a few functions she had and has. So, for instance, she's founding member and president of the European Law Institute, chair of the Academic Council of the Austrian Academy of Science, of ÖAW, and she had several roles also on the European level. And yeah, I think that's already gives a glimpse of her expertise and her knowledge. And I'm very happy, Christiane, to pass over you, and I wish you all an exciting and thoughtful panel discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Stefan. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you're calling. It's really an honor and privilege for me to chair this panel discussion. And yes, the topic is really pertinent. We are talking about the R word again, R for regulation. Actually, we've been doing this now for a decade at least, but now the discussion has gained a new dimension, in particular with the new administration taking over in the US. I believe we've all heard people like J.D. Vance talking about European legislation threatening Europe, actually, with regard to its regulation. So it's certainly a changing world order we are facing, and also the issue of regulation and what it means for the digital space is, again, an extremely important topic. I should mention that the Digital Humanism Initiative took all these new developments as you know, they were prompted by all these new developments to issue an open letter and publish an open letter on the urgent need to regulate digital technologies. So this open letter has now already almost 350 signatories, great names on the list, and maybe we have an opportunity to discuss that later, but I just wanted to mention it. And now it's my great honor to introduce our amazing panel to you. All three experts don't really need an introduction, in particular not in this audience. I will just briefly mention we have Hans Akkermans. Hans Akkermans is Professor Emeritus of Business Informatics at the University of Amsterdam, and he's a professor in Ghana at the IWM in Vienna and at the TU Wien in Vienna too. He is a founding director of the Interdisciplinary Network Institute in Amsterdam. And he's also a co-chair of the Digital Humanism Curriculum Working Group. We also have George Metakides, who is a professor of mathematical logic. He has held positions at great places such as MIT, Cornell, Rochester, and Patras University, and he has become known also to a wider audience as the director of the Esprit program from 1993 to 1998, and he's also heavily involved in all activities of the Digital Humanism Initiative. And we have Marc Rotenberg. Marc Rotenberg is president and founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy, which is a global network of AI policy experts and human rights advocates. And I should mention that 2 publications will be released this week only. It's the AI Policy Sourcebook and the AI and Democratic Values Index. And I'm sure that Marc will talk about that later. Besides that, he teaches law at Georgetown Law. So it's really an amazing panel. And maybe I start with you, George, if you permit. We see regulation coming under attack, right? So it's been a long time. The R word has always been a difficult thing, and there have always been opponents, and people said regulation is bad, but this is now almost unprecedented, what we are seeing. And I was wondering, George, if you could share your thoughts about this new situation with us, with regulation really coming under fierce attack. George, over to you.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for providing this tag for me, because this is a topic with several dimensions, and I will try to be complementary to my co-panelists as best I can. Can I have the first slide? Thank you. So I put it in the form of a question, but without losing any time, let's move to the next slide, which provides the answer. And the short answer is yes. Regulation is under attack, and the attack is coming from several different angles. There is the good old ideological, ultra-liberal attack. That's an angle that has been there for a while. There are people that honestly believe that any kind of regulation is freedom limiting. They do not accept the, let's say, John Stuart Mill's harm principle. They just feel that let it rip, and unseen forces will take care of things. This is not new. It's just taking now a different edge. And I mentioned this enhanced games because I don't know if everybody in the audience is familiar. This is a new project to be realized in 2026. It is financed by Peter Thiel, the patron and mentor of J.D. Vance that was mentioned earlier, but also Donald Trump Jr. And simply put, it's track and field, but without any ban on substances, on drugs. I mean, take everything to enhance your performance. And the rationale, if you read the way it was announced, is chilling. It's that this way we find the limits of what enhanced human beings can do, like breaking Usain Bolt's record at the 100 meters dash. So it's this is an old angle, but it's pursued now with renewed vigor. There's also the corporate self-interest. This is not new either. This is unlike the ideological, which for some of the people promoting it is intellectually honest. The corporate self-interest angle is hypocritical. In other words, when Zuckerberg decries censorship, I don't think there's anybody that believes this to be his main motive. And the same thing about tired slogans like regulation stifles innovation, and such false dilemmas that ignore what happened with electricity, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and so on over the last decade. The totally new angle is the geopolitical angle, because now it's not just big tech, which protects their interests as they're justified to do. But that comes together in a confluence of economic and political power, with the President of the United States saying, and this is just a quote, it's his words, not mine, that the EU is an atrocity created to screw us, and that regulation is used to tax our companies. And to document that, if I can have the next slide. This is the link is provided in the previous slide for those of you that want to read it. But this is the White House, what the White House put out on February 21st, which says defending American companies and innovators from overseas extortion and unfair fines and penalties. If you read it, next slide, please. It's clear that the key targets attacked are the three latest, most powerful European Union regulations: the Digital Markets Act, or DMA, the Digital Services Act, or DSA, and the AI Act. Digital Markets Act is effectively an antitrust, is to prevent or limit the monopolistic power. And under this act, Brussels can impose penalties of up to 10% of global turnover, which for these companies, big tech, means billions of dollars. The US president has called these EU penalties overseas extortion. Okay. Now, it's very important to realize that we're at a critical point, because there are indications that European authorities are under a lot of pressure to step back. And what is happening now is that fines related, for example, to app store rules and Meta so-called pay of consent model are expected to be minimal. What I'm saying is that the pressure, the attack, is already producing some results. One of the results is to minimize the fines. There are others that I'll come to before finishing. The Digital Services Act that aims to protect from harmful content. Musk's X has been found in breach as a VLOP. What's VLOP? Very large online provider, obliged to provide transparency of content moderation, which of course Musk describes as censorship. And there is pressure there as we speak to either minimize and or defer fines. There are some member states, European member states, who are being afraid of tariffs or being hopeful that tariffs will be aimed in a way that spares their particular interests, are asking the European Commission to defer fines up to 4 years until the end of the current US administration term. Next slide, please. And the third emblematic regulation, which is the AI Act, we at Digital Humanism are very familiar with it. We had a lot of discussions about it, and our first open letter was about protecting the AI Act from being sunk by lobbying as it was approaching the finish line. We, together with other like-minded organizations, and well, let's put it this way, it's hard to measure what each open letter succeeds. But at the end, it was passed. But the AI Act is supposed to take full effect in 2026, and now the so-called code of practice is being developed. This is the tool for implementing the act. 2 drafts had already been prepared, and now in the third draft, there is a threatening watering down, moving from classifying certain things, instead of classifying them as mandatory, to moving them to a category of optional. These reports, the one on the left is from Tech News on last Friday that describes how the whole AI Act is threatened by this attack. And just as a courtesy and a show of respect for my co-panelist Marc, that's from his kind update. Says, following intense lobbying, the European Commission is considering making key sections of the EU's AI Act optional rather than mandatory, according to the Financial Times. At issue is the draft code of practice that would guide implementation of rules for powerful AI systems. I offer this as evidence that the attack is real, the attack has force behind it, and now is the time to try in every way we can to see if there can be an effective pushback. Next slide, please. Now, up till now, everything I've told you is factual. There's whatever. It's not an issue of opinion. These are facts. Now I'll say something that I know is disputable. I know it's not shared by everybody, but I feel very strongly about it, so I'll say it. I feel that this combination, this confluence of economic and technical and political power is very dangerous for the very concept of liberal democracy as we know it. I think that it threatens the fundamental principles of democratic institutions, and it's transforming not just the United States, but what we've been calling the West and the entire world order. Regulation is one battering ram of this attack, but what is being attacked is much broader. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide. What can we do? We have produced as Digital Humanism an open letter that asks the European institutions to stand firm on against this attack. This is fine. It's a positive step. It's certainly not enough. The next step now is to submit this open letter as a petition in the European Parliament, and we have set up the mechanism for doing so. Let's say the strategy is to depoliticize without retreating. If you see the March 18 decision on applying DMA on Google and Apple, it was done in a firm way by Commissioner Ribeiro, but there was no press conference afterwards. It just said that we're just applying the law. We would have applied it if these companies were European, irrespective of the fact that they are American. Furthermore, we could and should reach to like-minded colleagues and organizations worldwide, because it's not just the European Union where this attack is taking place against regulation. It's also Brazil, South Korea, India, and Japan, and all the other countries within which the European Union is conducting the so-called digital dialogue, and which in some way or another are adapting and adopting European regulation or developing their own, but in the same spirit. There was a very respected, let's say, suggestion that we should wait and see, not act too strongly. I think that time is past. I think we should anticipate next moves and take action accordingly. We should also realize, because there have been a lot of publications about European digital sovereignty and they're all very valuable lately, that digital sovereignty without defense sovereignty is an illusion. And the letter Draghi proposals are a blueprint for proceeding along those lines. with the understanding that soft power, if it's not complemented by a modicum of hard power, becomes mushy power and then no power at all. And finally, I think it's very important, and it's our obligation to try to learn to explain all this much better to young people. I've been involved in an effort to do that recently, and I was stunned by many of the responses were, yes, I mean, you are right, but what can we do? We're helpless. This is wrong. We should try to explain both what is happening and also what action can be taken, because the classrooms of today are indeed the societies of tomorrow. And finally, we often in digital humanism tell each other that we all have a moral duty to be optimistic, and indeed we do. I believe that we also have a moral duty to take whatever action we can to provide the basis for such optimism. And with this, I stop and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, George. That was really great, and thank you also for ending with this quite optimistic tone, actually, which puts the focus rather on action than on being afraid of what's going on. I think you touched on extremely important points, and I'm sure we will have the time to come back to them later in the discussion. But for now, I would like to turn to Hans. Hans, George has already said it's not just about regulation. It's really about more. It's not just that. It's really our democracies. It's rule of law. It's really more. And I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts with us on whether it's regulation or to what extent it goes far beyond.
Yes, thank you, Christian. I will share my slides. I guess this works.
Yes, it does.
Yes, I'm very much in sync with the last part of George. So the open letter that we have written is about the urgent need for regulation. And currently, I am very much in support of that. There is a big need to regulate. But I think that recent developments are are qualitatively different, I think. With respect, so it's not just anymore about the idea of regulation. What is happening, I think, is it's not only the nature of regulation, it is also about the institutions and mechanisms that can regulate. And they are also under attack now, and that is what we see globally. So democratic institutions, mechanisms are under attack or are sidelined, just ignoring judgments by the judicial system, for example, and are hollowed out in authoritarian policies that you see in many different countries, also in Europe, even in my own little country of Netherlands, and they are driven by the extreme right. And we refer to I see this as a kind of new phase, and Jürgen Habermas has been publishing about it. Actually, his first book that was published in 1960 was about the emergence of mass media, at that time television especially, and that it restructured basically the public and political discourse. And what, in my view, you see now is that the digital big tech social media even more fundamentally influence, alter, and even manipulate social political discourse and deliberation. And this is, I think, a very worrying development, which is, as George says, is also beyond regulation. So it's about our fundamental values that are at stake here. And this is not only in the digital technology sector. So clearly, digital big tech has achieved enormous concentration of monopolistic power in the sector itself. But what the digital transformation currently is doing also is that it creates a confluence of monopolistic power across key industrial and societal sectors as well. So big tech not only has a very good grip on the social media and so on mass media, but also they are entering, given the current developments, including military defense, war economy, so a kind of new military industrial complex, which I think is really very worrying. Thirdly, digital big tech has installed itself in the heart of public government, so they are now at the center of the political process itself. And this is, I think, very clear in the case of the United States, but it's not only there. What I also see is civil society sectors are made suspect. You see big budget cuts in many different countries on education, culture, the cultural wars. So make all these civil society sectors suspect and undermine them. And finally, I think even basic idea of universal human rights and democracy and universal human values must be protected now by us. So I think that is a part of our fundamental program that is indeed beyond regulation. So what I think is what you might call a kind of digitally expanded Sustainable Development Goals program. First of all, we should keep up the rather minimal set of Sustainable Development Goals, but we should expand them with basically new steps in what I would call a fair and inclusive digital society. So that is basically my solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hans, and also for these proposals. The 18th SDG is really something that's been under discussion now, and thank you so much for bringing this up, and also for bringing Habermas into the equation, because I think that's really pertinent. You mentioned it's civil society that's under attack, and I couldn't agree more. It's civil society with its institutions, with its organizations. It's the very idea of human rights. Now Marc Rotenberg actually runs an organization that, you know, fights for democratic values, that fights for human rights. So he runs a civil society organization. Marc, I was wondering, could you share your views with us on, you know, what does all this mean for democratic values? Could you maybe also share your US perspective? I mean, so far we've been citing many politicians or quasi-politicians such as Elon Musk. It was just on the photograph. So how's this? What is the situation in the US? And could you give us, you know, the broader picture there? Marc, over to you. Thank you.
I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you. I think I'm going to begin focusing on the AI policy work we're currently doing, and then I'm happy to address some of these broader questions, which are clearly relevant to our discussion about what's happening in the US in terms of democracy and constitutional structure. But Christine, you did mention that we have two new publications coming out this week. And if it's okay, I'd like to put in a brief promotion because I believe both are actually relevant, directly relevant to the conversation that we're having. The first publication is a project that I did almost 6 years ago. I published the first compendium of AI policies at a time when AI governance was frankly still in its infancy. So there was then in 2019 many ethical principles, many frameworks for responsible AI. And then, of course, this was followed with the work on the EU AI Act and the Council of Europe AI Treaty and national strategies. So I've actually come back to all these materials, updated them, compiled them, and I think this is a very good reference work for those who are interested in the topic of AI and regulation. I include in the introduction a couple of insights, and one of them is that while the technology is obviously evolving very rapidly, so too are the regulatory frameworks. And this to me is actually quite fascinating because, of course, we traditionally speak about regulation lagging behind technology, which as a general proposition is true. But at the same time, if you look at the efforts of governments, both on the national and international level over the last several years, I have never seen so much energy in any field of technology or digital policy devoted to the regulation of AI. And with this publication, we hope to provide at least a snapshot of this moment in time to help others identify those trends. The other big publication which we are releasing this week is, I would say, more of an empirical study. As many of you may know, we have a very large research network at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. We now span more than 100 countries, and we have people actively engaged in reporting on developments in their country. So we produce annually narrative reports, country by country, as well as a methodology to evaluate rate and rank countries' AI policies and practices. I see Moshe Vardi is on our call today. I actually want to extend thanks to Moshe. He encouraged me in the early days to publish a brief paper for CACM outlining how this might be done, and we've continued to build upon it over 5 years. It's frankly a remarkable project. Our 2025 edition runs almost 1,600 pages. I believe it has over 7,000 footnotes. We haven't broken Microsoft Word yet, but we're certainly pushing up against the edge. And then, if I may, the one last timely development to call your attention to, seems to have gone missing. It'll take me just a moment to find it. But we are this week hosting, and the reason for these publications in this moment is we are this week hosting a very big conference on the theme of AI and democratic values. And we're actually quite proud of the participants we have in the event. Let's see if I can share this for you. Here we go. So we begin by recognizing our AI policy leaders in academics and civil society and government and business. We're fortunate to have Senator Richard Blumenthal giving preliminary remarks. Senator Blumenthal actually sponsored in the U.S. Congress legislation called the U.S. AI Act that looks very much like the EU AI Act. He is a senior member of the Democratic Party, has also worked well with Republican leadership on AI regulation. Stuart, I guess, needs no introduction. He is focusing on human values AI risk and global governance. And finally, this person who's probably not known to you, but Skye Perryman, has actually been coordinating much of the litigation against the executive orders that President Trump has issued over the last couple of months. And she will be speaking specifically about Musk, Doge, and AI, the next steps. So I just wanted to share that with you. You're all welcome to join us. It begins April 3rd, Thursday, 9 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. So I guess Central European, that would be about 2 in the afternoon. And we'd be happy to have you join us. So what I've tried to do, I guess, by way of these various slides is to say, one, there is a lot of regulation already in place. I think we need to understand it, assess it, see areas of convergence and divergence, and also forward progress. Two, the developments at the national level are remarkable and interesting. New issues are emerging from year to year. This year we focused on the issue of AI and sustainability, which when we started this project we had not even thought of. But of course, understanding now the energy requirements of data centers has become a concern for national governments. And three, I think to George's earlier point, I mean, we remain optimistic. We see political leaders across the spectrum in the US who believe that AI regulation is important. We look at the polling data. Americans strongly favor the regulation of AI. I would not say that they're anti-technology. They're enthusiastic about the possibility of breakthroughs in medical science and other areas of research. And at the same time, they don't want AI to take their jobs or to become their children's best friends. So I think we can see through the public debate and discussion, reasoned, thoughtful discourse. And of course, we are aiming to help, support, and encourage that. So I will stop there. As I said, I'm happy to say more about what's happening on the legal front in the US. I'm involved in some of the cases involving the executive orders, and I can talk about that as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Marc, for sharing also the really important work your organization is doing. And I would certainly join that workshop if we didn't have another digital humanism initiative workshop at the same time. So, and thanks also for offering to talk a little bit more about the American initiatives. And if I may come back to that. I found it really intriguing what you said about American voters being in principle pro-regulation because they don't want AI to take their jobs. They don't want AI to be their children's best friend. So that is certainly not, the impression you get when you read European media. And also in European media, those attempts to establish something like an US AI Act, and so they're not very prominent. Of course, the legal community is aware of all that's happening, but it's not very prominent. And so I would really be grateful if you could give us a little bit more of a background about what's currently happening. We've seen so many initiatives of the like in the US, and they never finally made it. What do you think is, the likelihood of any of this coming to fruition? And then something I would really be interested in is there a fundamental difference in approach? You said, the bills that are being prepared, they look surprisingly similar to the EU AI Act, but do you sense a difference, and where do you think the difference lies? So, Marc, over to you again, if I may.
Sure. So I'll jump right in on the big democracy issue and then come back, I guess, to AI. I mean, I think there's no question right now that the United States is in a constitutional moment. I would not yet call it a constitutional crisis, although some people have. But President Trump is clearly seeking to establish much greater executive authority than any president in U.S. history. And he's doing this essentially by means of fiat, which is the executive power to issue executive orders. He's issued dozens, maybe over 100 at this point. Many of these orders would strike most law school students, if I may say frankly, as almost absurd, because on their face, it's apparent that the president doesn't have this authority. But if you promulgate 100 orders, even if 70 are tossed aside, 30 could remain in place. And what we're seeing in this moment are many lawsuits challenging, for example, his ability to deport Venezuelans in the United States without any due process, challenging his ability to dismantle independent commissions that have been established by acts of Congress, challenging his ability to effectively impound funds that were previously appropriated by Congress for foreign aid, for domestic research, a dozen categories like this. And these cases, which have been heard by federal judges in the US, I would say for the most part have actually gone against Trump, which is to say that when he places his executive order before the federal judiciary, judges, both Democrats and Republicans, have said essentially this exceeds Article 2 of the US Constitution, which is our rough description of presidential powers. You don't read much about this in the press. The press tends to emphasize, this great conflict, and the conflict is real. But I would say, at least in this moment, there's been far more legal success in pushing back against the executive orders than most people are aware of. But as I say, the story's not over. Many of these decisions from the lower courts are being appealed. They will likely be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, and then it will be up to the court to decide how much authority does the president have consistent with the Constitution. That's, in this moment, still an open question. A brief word about AI in this context. I was at, actually, the Paris AI Action Summit in February, where the U.S., I think, made a critical mistake choosing not to sign the final declaration from 60 nations, and where the vice president made some very harsh remarks about U.S. relations with Europe. All of that happened. But at the same time, on the fringes of the conference, in the side rooms, in the meetings of UNESCO and Council of Europe and OECD and ambassadors and ministers, a lot of progress was made. A lot of those developments did not receive much attention. The focus was on Vance. But again, I guess if there's a second insight I can provide is that in the background, the picture is not quite as bad as the headlines may be screaming in the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Marc. That is certainly reassuring. Nevertheless, I mean, it's an extremely difficult situation, and we're seeing problematic developments all over the world. So democracies could be at a really crucial point at a crossroads, and it's really so important we protect our societies. Now, Hans, maybe you stressed that part, right? So to have a resilient society, to add an 18th sustainable development goal, and so on and so forth. And there are those people who question the role which regulation, and this panel is about regulation, plays for society. They say, well, our societies need just more ethics. It's not just regulation, it's ethics, it's maybe education, but not just regulation. Regulation doesn't really help our society. So what do you tell those people who kind of downplay the role of regulation, or even say regulation is bad and we should rather go for ethics, for education, and try to get to resilient societies by those means.
Thank you. A kind of standard argument is that regulation stifles innovation. That's typically what big tech is saying. And I think there are 2 points here. One is that if you look into the history of all kinds of technologies, that regulation simply does not stifle innovation. If you take, I worked for a long time in the field of smart electricity grids, and that is a very technical area with lots and lots of regulation. These regulations have never stopped the sector from developing. And regulation, also what you see in the automobile industry, stricter demands on environmental sustainability for those sectors actually have driven innovation. So I think the whole argument is also historically and in a comparative perspective incorrect. And the second thing is, I think, regulation should be rooted in these democratic and humanistic values, and should be some form of implementation of that. That would be good regulation, and that is important. So it is not something apart, but it's a form of implementation of our basic values. And I think, as Marc says, there is a lot of consensus on these very basic things, and that is a positive thing, and that's why a society can be resilient.
Thank you so much, Hans. And just to say, there's something wrong with your mic. So if there is another mic you could use, we would probably understand better. But we understood you well enough. George, you stressed the importance, really, and that was also stressed in the open letter, that the EU now takes a strong stand with regard to the AI Act, the DSA, the DMA. But just as a kind of, playing the advocatus diaboli for a moment, there are also those people who say, well, I mean, there are alternatives. For example, the Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI boasts itself as being the first ever legally binding treaty, and many countries such as Switzerland, for example, and UK, and so they're more heading towards this softer type of regulation. And there are many people around who say, well, actually, that's been a little bit too quick in the EU, and we should rather have taken this soft approach of this same framework convention. So what is your position on that?
Well, there are voices and there are voices. There are criticisms and there are criticisms. There is well-meant criticism about any regulation. Nobody would argue that all regulation is good. There can be bad regulation, there can be over-regulation, there can be under-regulation. There's also the difference between, let's say, declarative and actionable. It's the Council of Europe that Marc has worked very diligently to promote, and successfully, I would add, is it's fine, to be ratified at the declarative level, but then the hope is that those that ratify it also write laws to implement it. So the AI Act is, and the DMA and the DSA are actionable regulations. have they been too early? A well-meant discussion can always take place, and it took place. The AI Act was not born out of Zeus's head. It was debated, deliberated. There were all kinds of committees of experts in the code of practice. Now there are 4 working groups. Joshua Benjo led one. I don't know who among the people we know. Marietta Schaake read another one. The point now is that regulation is coming under attack, not for, say, reasons that it may have been too early or it may have overachieved. The criticism is that all of it should be thrown out, and if not, is that possible, water it down as much as possible, and equating regulation with tariffs. This is what is wrong. This is a bad approach. If there was a well-meaning approach of, as there was up to a certain point, at Transatlantic Trade and Technology Committee, the TTC, between the EU and the US. That's frozen now. The Biden executive order at the declarative level had many things that the AI Act had at the operational level. Now that has been rescinded. So I think what we're facing now is a direct attack trying A, to water down legislation, B, to weaken the enforcement of laws. And we all know that in a democracy, if you weaken the enforcement of law, you weaken the rule of law and democracy itself. So it's the nature of the attack that is wrong. Nobody would argue this way against the well-meaning discussion of how to adjust or readjust regulation as technology evolves.
Oh, thank you so much, George, for these really clear statements. And of course, I fully agree with you there. Thanks also for mentioning, the fact that there is good regulation and bad regulation. And so I was wondering, Marc, you're now in the US in a situation where you're discussing future regulation, and you certainly have an idea about, what is good, a good proposal and what is a bad proposal. How would you characterize good regulation versus bad poor regulation?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very difficult question to answer. I mean, oftentimes we use cliches like regulation should be technology neutral. Regulation should build on similar prior regulation. But even those types of general approaches don't provide very precise answers. I will say that in putting together these 2 publications, the Policy Sourcebook and the Democratic Values Index, there are many themes that reemerge. And one theme, for example, is the need for effective institutions as supervisory authorities. You need to appreciate that not every approach to regulation is necessarily the formulation of a rule. And then I would say you also need a sense that you allocate rights and responsibilities when you're creating good regulation. And you need to be clear if someone is harmed by a device, what their rights will be, and you need to be clear if someone is providing a device or a service, what their responsibilities will be. One of the insights I've had over the years about regulation is that those rights and responsibilities are necessarily going to be applied asymmetrically, because the service provider is simply in a much better position to reduce risk than the user of the service. But again, I would say these are general guidelines, and of course the actual work of writing effective regulation is really a difficult task. And if I may add just one final point, this issue of, regulation versus innovation, which I think we would all say is just, it's a cliche, it's not descriptively accurate. But what's most remarkable about the United States experience is if you say, well, which state in the US is most innovative when it comes to technology? People would raise their hands and say, well, that's probably California. And then if I asked you next, which state in the US has the most regulation of technology, you should keep your hand up because it's still California, yes? And if we were in a world where regulation was opposed to innovation, we would expect California to be a regulatory desert. But the opposite is the reality. So I think it's worth keeping that example in mind when we think about the relationship between innovation and regulation. It's my view that sustainable innovation requires regulation. There are a lot of things you can do, of course, in the absence of regulation, but to create sustainable markets and consumer trust, none of that happens without a regulatory framework.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And also as a lawyer, I mean, people are constantly laboring under the erroneous assumption that without regulation, you're in a legal void. No, you're not.
Oh, that's
You're
right.
in a patchwork of all sorts of different approaches. You have uncertainty. Is that good for business? Patchworks and uncertainty? No. Business needs certainty. Business needs a clear framework. Needs a level playing field. George, you don't have to raise your hand. You're one of the panelists. Just speak out. We can't hear you, George. You're still muted. Sorry.
I didn't raise my hand the way Marc raises his hand.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to support what Marc said. I mean, historically, if you look at regulation, I mean, in the early electricity days, the fact that it took 40 years for electricity to come into the house, because to the factories it went, but it took regulation. It's regulation that enabled the market and innovation to grow, because otherwise electric appliances were so dangerous, and people just didn't buy them because they were afraid of using them. Two most recent, let's say, events. I remember very well in 1993 with my late friend Michael Dertuzos. We were at MIT at a conference on privacy and security, Marc, and there were some government people that were using the same cliche that it's a zero-sum game. You have to give up some privacy to have security, and it was how shall I put it? Almost everybody that participated disproved that statement by giving clear examples, and you could have security for privacy. And I remember at the end, the government person was a bit despaired and said, "Well, what can I do given my position?" And there was a voice from the back of the room: "Have you considered resigning?"
Yeah, okay, thank you. I realize we're at the moment a little bit having a discussion, a really thrilling debate among the panelists, which shouldn't exclude the audience. So yes, the other George, please.
Yes, well, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm not a lawyer, but currently during the energy transition, most of all in Germany and in Austria, people are crying, or let's say the utilities, they are crying for regulations because they fostered to bring photovoltaics to the grid, and they've forgotten the regulations to say if the power is too much, then you have to switch it just off. And currently they do not have means to do that because the regulations do not exist so far. And therefore, we've been a few times very close to blackout here in Austria or Europe, not because we lack of energy, we have too much of sun during the, well, bright sunshine in Europe, and we have too much power in the grid. So lack of regulation can be very bad.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for this illustration, even though it sounds bad that we are so close to a blackout. I take this as a comment that largely supports what the other George just said. So I guess we don't need to go back to the panel. Moshe, please.
I want to follow up on George on your comment that about sovereignty. And I completely agree with you. There is one minor hitch. Sovereignty costs money. Are we willing, is Europe willing to spend the money to assert the sovereignty?
Thank you so much. That was a question, I think, to the panel.
Yes,
and
yes.
maybe primarily to George, but also to the other panelists. I think it's an extremely valid question. So
it's no, I mean it's absolutely correct. It costs a lot of money, and that's why the Letta Draghi report provides for that money. It's 800 billions, which is a huge amount of money, and it's to dovetail defense development with innovation, including in digital technologies. And if you read the Draghi report in particular, it effectively says that you can't have one without the other. Not in the Frank Sinatra way, but I mean, the digital technology innovation and defense innovation these days go hand in hand. And if Europe is going to stand its ground, it has to proceed along these lines and make this common investment. Will it? That's another question.
yeah, thank you so much. Would the other panelists like to react? No? Then we go to Edward.
I have a question for Marc. I appreciate your optimism about the role of the courts, but what I'm seeing is a little different, right? It's an open flouting of the court rulings and intimidation of law firms that are acting against the administration, and all kinds of other intimidation tactics, firing of prosecutors, firing of special counsel. Do you really believe that the courts are going to be able to put some restraint on this?
Well, that is the question. Let me begin by saying I don't mean to minimize in any dimension the extent to which Trump is trying to expand presidential power. It's absolutely without precedent. He is targeting political opponents. He's targeting universities. He's removing civil servants in the Department of Justice who are prosecuting criminal cases against people who gave money to Trump. I mean, there's, no end to the list of things that cause concern. But let me say also about the situation with the courts. I was very heartened about a week ago when I saw the name of the lawyer that's defending one of Trump's targets. It's a law firm in Washington known as Wilmer Hale, a very well-regarded law firm, leans Democrat, but not, extreme in any regard. The lawyer who decided to defend Wilmer Hale is Paul Clement, who's probably the most famous Republican lawyer in the United States, served as Solicitor General for President Bush. And the fact that Clement stood up to the executive order targeting Wilmer Hale actually sent a very powerful message to the US legal community, which is that I believe the institution of law and the lawyers committed to legal institutions are going to stand up. And this goes all the way to the Chief Justice John Roberts. I don't see a future in which the Chief Justice allows the president to seize the power he's trying to obtain.
Just to add a quote, Marc, from Trump, he said that someone who tries to save his country cannot be breaking the law.
Well, yes, I mean, and of course, this would be an entirely different discussion if we wanted to talk about how bad things are. But I'm also trying to provide some insight into the process and share with you some things that you may not be reading in the news. And continuing in your spirit, George, I think we do have a moral duty to remain optimistic.
Thank you so much. Edward, you'd like, no, Moshe, sorry.
A bit follow-up. I mean, this is a bit of a digression from the main topic, but a conversation I had recently, email conversation recently with two constitutional scholars, and where I challenged the notion of three co-equal branches of the government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And at the end, they had to agree with me. The three branches are not co-equal, because only the executive branch can use force. It has monopoly on the use of force. Other branches have the moral power, if you want. But at the end of the day, only the executive branch can use physical force. So a court can issue a subpoena. Well, who's going to enforce it? A court can issue a fine on contempt of court against administration officials. Who will enforce it? So we have to remember that at the end, what holds us together is not the letter of the law, but the norms that we are all playing by. We are following the rules. If somebody decide, administration, executive branch decide not to follow the rules, there's no enforcement mechanism.
Well, Moshe, let me say that discussion is being had in many law schools across the country and many law firms across the country, and there are any number of counter strategies that have also been discussed. I mean, I agree with you on the one hand. Yes, of course, the president has force. The other two branches don't. Norms are key. But I'd also say, the Trump administration has been careful walking this line. There's a lot of bluster.
So far, yeah.
There's a lot of things they say that they should not say about impeaching judges who render decisions they don't agree with. It was notable that Chief Justice Roberts stood up and said, that's not the way we act in the US. If you don't like a decision, you appeal it. You don't remove the judge. And then they quieted down. So, we don't know yet the ending to the story. But at least in the moment, I think we should not give up what we don't need to give up. And many of the rulings, as I said, from the courts so far have actually been quite favorable. The message that's coming back to the Trump administration, as I suggested at the beginning, is, they have 100 executive orders out there. Maybe not 30, but maybe 20 stand, or maybe 10 stand. And maybe those 10 or 20 are a real problem for us. I mean, we can knock out 90% of executive overreach and still be left with a lot of very serious problems. But a lot of these initiatives are being knocked down.
Indeed, but to add something, to complement what Moshe said, the difference in force, in applying force capability of the three branches becomes important, becomes dangerous when the independence of the three branches is eroded. The independence as Montesquieu defined it. And I would challenge you to show many countries today where the independence of the three branches is really adhered to. There are few in Europe, the majority, and in the US, I mean, with the politicized Supreme Court, with the so-called Obama judges and Trump judges, is it possible to talk about independence of the judiciary from the executive?
Well, as I said earlier, the judges that have struck down the executive orders, I believe, are from 7 different administrations, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump 1. I mean, those judges have been named by many different presidents. These cases have ended up in many different courts. And as I said, most of the judges have ruled against them. But if I may make one other point, it's certainly a concern at the federal level in terms of the checks and balances among the 3 branches of government. But of course, the U.S. is also a federalist system, and we have strong state authorities. And another hopeful sign, so let me say, Trump is exercising control over the federal Department of Justice and limiting the type of activities the Justice Department would normally pursue. So who has stood up in their place? And the answer is the attorney generals of the various states. So you actually have the state attorney generals now bringing challenges to many of the executive orders, even as the Department of Justice stays on the sidelines. So there are a lot of different dynamics in this moment to follow.
That is correct. And that's why Musk is now spending a lot of money, and not only in Wisconsin.
It's true. That election is today, by the way. There are several critical elections. I mean, it's interesting we're meeting today. The Wisconsin race, there's an open seat in Congress in Florida and another one in New York. So we have special elections. Normally the elections would be held in November, but these seats are now open and the elections are taking place today. And some people have said, I think correctly, that the outcome of these races in Congress can be viewed as a referendum on the Trump presidency. So if he loses those seats, that's a clear setback. If the margin of victory is less than what Trump had obtained, that could be a warning sign. If there's no real difference and the Republicans were placed in these seats, it might look good to him. And of course, the Wisconsin race, which is an election for a judge, is actually critical because that state court is now divided 3-3, and the selection of the 7th member will largely determine what happens, for example, if there are challenges to an election outcome in 2028.
And the redistricting, changing the districts, which can make a difference.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, and I hope we will have the results soon of that race. And thank you also for the reassuring words, which is certainly something that is badly needed in other areas of the world that are looking towards the US and are getting a really, really depressing view of the situation. Now, maybe as we need to slowly wrap up, a couple of further questions to the panel. Now, for a long time, everybody's been talking about the Brussels effect or the California effect, right? So this idea that if you are a really important market and people want to sell their products and services into that market, you have really a lot of soft power by way of regulation, because those others that want to sell products and services into your region will have to adapt to your ways of regulating things, and that means you take influence indirectly worldwide. Is that still a valid, it's not a metaphor, but is this really still valid, this Brussels effect or California effect, or do we need a new strategy and a new maybe even way of strategically regulating in the light of the changing world order? This is a question I would like to ask to all three panelists. Maybe I start with Hans as we Hans, what is your view on that? So do we need a new strategy really in areas in the world that are pro-regulation in principle? Can they just carry on as they used to do, or is it time for really reassessing things a little bit?
What is called the Brussels effect is real. The literature about it, you usually have the countries taking over similar ideas. I think this is a more general thing that countries that do interesting things, they are looked upon by other countries and they pick out what they can use. In that sense, it doesn't change the situation for Europe. What is the proper way of addressing these digital and politics issues? So you must develop new strategies depending on the situation. So I do think that now is a kind of qualitatively different situation where we have to rethink a lot of things. And I would like to make a comment on Europe, on the issue of sovereignty and autonomy. Indeed, as has been said, the task for Europe is to become more sovereign and more autonomous, and that costs a lot of innovation and money. And you have to spend that in some way. I'm a bit more skeptical on the idea that defense innovation and digital innovation go hand in hand. If you look at the Cold War situation where you had a civil arms race, it was not the arms race that solved the issues of the then Cold War. And I think there is a danger that we are too easily sliding into some new arms race that will not really address the issues, also the geopolitical issues that are in the case in Europe. So we need all kinds of new arrangements, and we need alternative infrastructures and that are more autonomous and sovereign, and we have to develop them. But a digital arms race would be a very big danger, I think.
Yes, thank you so much. I have to apologize to Alireza. Alireza, you can ask your question yourself, but maybe I also read it out to the panel, because maybe before we answer my question, we should answer Alireza's question. And the question is, how do we ensure that AI regulation works in reality, especially when big tech companies resist regulations, politicians don't understand AI, and the technology evolves so fast? Is there any success story of this? So maybe that's a question I would ask primarily to the panel, but maybe if you can, of course, also answer the other question with the Brussels effect, just that we make sure we answer this question from the audience. I don't know, George, Marc, who of you would like to chip in?
I'll quickly jump in. I also want to acknowledge Alireza as an active member of our CADEP research team and help put together some very nice graphics for the release of our report this week. But as I think he knows, in our methodology for evaluating national AI policies and practices, we typically ask a two-part question. We ask, has a country endorsed the OECD AI principles, and have they implemented the OECD AI principles? Is a country signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? and are they implementing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And the methodology is actually designed to focus on this question, which is evaluating implementation of the normative standards that countries will readily agree to. But actually, that's where the hard work comes in. We do this also, I think, for the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics. We evaluate implementation in addition to endorsement. To be sure, it's always the greatest challenge. It's much, much easier for governments to sign a paper than to do what the paper requires. But that's a big part of the reason for the annual report we prepare.
Great, thank you. George, any thoughts on this?
I can add to that. At the declarative level, there seems to be little difficulty. I mean, if there's a declaration take the United Nations report, it's a bit hectic to go through because there were too many pens involved. But most of it is motherhood and apple pie stuff. I mean, who can go against it? It's when you try to go to the operational level that things become difficult. At the declarative level, there were, I don't know, Marc can correct me if I'm wrong, but there were two votes by the United Nations General Assembly, one proposed by the Chinese with US support, and the other proposed by the US with Chinese support, and they both passed. I mean, why wouldn't they? Things get hairy when you get at the operational level. And there, to address what you asked about the Brussels effect. The Brussels effect, at least the way, Anu Bradford described it in the book where she coined the term. At that time, it was the privacy issue, and it came to fill a vacuum. The European Union came up with GDPR, and many countries adopted something similar because it was around and it was easy to do. It's not the same now with AI. It's much more difficult, but, and this is what is happening with Brazil. Brazil's AI Act, it's not the same as the EU AI Act, but it starts with a classification of high risk and so on. It's quite similar. The South Korea one, when it talks about high impact, so it's more like an adapt and adopt new version, weaker version of the Brussels effect, which could and should be replaced at some point by a more global approach, which is what Marc's effort with the Council of Europe are aiming at. So the Brussels effect is more of a practical thing that is happening in particular with trade partners of the EU, but it's not as such a mechanism, a global mechanism. It was never meant to be.
Thank you so much. And I realize we need to wrap up. This is really fascinating. I think we could go on for hours, but Hans, please.
Yes.
Raise your hand.
Yes, I would like to answer the question of Alireza in perhaps a surprising way. So his question is, how do we ensure that AI regulation works in reality, especially when big tech companies resist regulations, when politicians don't understand AI and the technology evolves fast? Is there any success story of this that exists? Then I would answer, the end of the Cold War is your example of a success story, because very much the same factors were there at the question was, how do we regulate the Cold War tensions, especially when heavy investments in military developments were done. Many companies were resisting regulations on in that score. Politicians do not understand AI, but they also do not understand nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And still, it has been possible to, in the fall of the Cold War, to find international arrangements that release the tensions. So I think this is actually an example.
Well,
But I
thank
think
you so much. Thank you so much, Hans. I think it's really good to finish this discussion with an example of a success story. And again, I could go. I think we could go on for hours. So I wish we had more time. But I see Peter is already impatiently waiting for me to wrap up. So all that remains for me is to thank really all three panelists. This has been amazing. Thanks to the audience for really good questions. And yeah, so with this, I would like to hand back to Peter.
Thank you. And I just used the opportunity to share this right away. Well, thank you, Christiane. Thanks all for really a fascinating discussion. I agree. This well, time flew really in. So it's a bit of a walk to get to the track that you already see here, but bear with me. We had no explicit suggestion for music from the panel for today. The, let's say, modern times oracle in the instantiation of DeepSeek was put to work to suggest a track. And that fits the description of the topic. And DeepSeek suggested many with convincing arguments, but rarely related to the contents of the track suggested. I picked one, as you can see, but here is what DeepSeek said. For a lecture on regulating the digital space with a focus on challenges, governance, and shifting power structures, you'll want an outro song that feels rebellious, thought-provoking, or thematically resonant. Here are some punky, bluesy, and indie picks that could work well. I went for a bluesy/gritty pick, namely When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin, offered as a powerful metaphor for systems collapsing under pressure. All right, so the origin of the song is actually the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. Yeah, so indeed as a metaphor for the need for regulation and also great American tragedies unfolding, it makes it quite a good pick. Now, throughout the talk, being reminded that we are damned to remain positive, I scrambled to find some good news and found this on the Wikipedia page. To prevent future floods, the federal government built the world's longest system of levees and floodways. Then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover's handling of the crisis gave him a positive nationwide reputation, helping pave the way to his election as US president in 1928. Again, the positive note here is that there is some opportunity for politicians taking up such a topic in the interest of people. All right, so that was a long walk, but finally I came like full circle to this track. So before we play the whole 7 minutes, I will announce the next event. Already next week on April 8th, Hans Akkermans will take the stage again and speak on decolonizing the future. Computer science is not just science/engineering anymore as it used to be in the old days. And this will be a hybrid event, as Hans is currently a guest professor at TU Wien. So if you are in Vienna, please stop by in person. Favoritenstraße 9, Zemanek Lecture Hall, 5 p.m. Thanks to Christiane, Marc, George, and Hans for the discussion, everyone else for participating. Goodbye and have a nice rest of the day, starting with Led Zeppelin.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, bye.